If you're a regular Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener, please rate and review us on iTunes or using the podcast app on your phone. We currently have 933 5-star ratings, and it would be great to get that up to 1,000. And so I want to give a special thank you to Whitney Treppel, who just gave us this 5-star review. Always great interviews. I never miss an episode, and I'm a proud Patreon supporter. Curtly is a great interviewer, and even when it's a guest I don't have any particular interest in, the interview is always interesting. The shows with guest panelists are frequently my favorite, especially if Erin Lindsey or Grady Hendrix are among the panelists. So big thanks again to Whitney Treppel for that great review. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 443 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Erin Lindsey, making her 25th appearance on the show. She's the author of the Bloodbound series of epic fantasy novels, and the Nicholas Lenoir series of paranormal detective novels, which she writes under the name Yael Tettensor. And we'll be speaking with her today about her new novel, The Silver Shooter, the third book in her Rose Gallagher series of historical mysteries. And now here's our interview with Erin Lindsey. All right, so we're here with Erin Lindsey. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so how did you first get interested in fantasy and science fiction?
Oh, wow. I don't remember a time when I wasn't interested in fantasy and science fiction. I think I have to blame my auntie, my mom's sister, who always had, and still to this day, has a membership to, those video clubs and eventually DVD clubs where you get a certain number every month of movies that came out.
She always just like VHS tapes or something.
Yeah, they started out and until recently were VHS tapes still, and then she started getting them eventually in DVDs. But anyways, my auntie always had all the movies, and we would go over there, and she would sit us in front of the television with these movies, and she was just completely into that stuff. So we grew up on Star Wars and The Dark Crystal and Superman and all of that kind of stuff. And we watched it and rewatched it. The Princess Bride, watched it again and again, and just really got intense about it. I also had had a Fisher-Price record player. And on that Fisher-Price record player, it was orange, plastic record player. And we had The Hobbit. You know The Hobbit that came out, the animated one that came out in the 80s?
Yeah. No, we were talking about that record when we talked about the Hobbit cartoon. Tom and Andrea both had fond memories of the record.
I listened to that to death, and also watched The Last Unicorn to death. So yeah, I mean, I just, before books were much more than, Charlotte's Web and stuff for me. And A Wrinkle in Time is probably the first book I remember from school that wasn't, a sort of see Dick run book.
Well, so how about as you're kind of getting into, like older, like, sort of teenage years and stuff, like what were the kind of fantasy and science fiction books that had the biggest impact on you?
Much more fantasy than science fiction as far as books go. In the movies, I was more interested in science fiction, but when it came to books, I was more into the fantasy. And I remember being really intense about Anne McCaffrey for a while. And yeah, I actually got really into the Dragonlance books back when that was still TSR. My brother started me down that path. He was into D&D when he was in sort of grade 8, grade 9. So I would have been grade 6, grade 7.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying all this stuff with a vague tone of trepidation, but I was totally into, like, I love the Dragonlance books. I had like 30 of them. I still have like 15 of them on my shelf there.
I guess I'm saying it with a tone of trepidation because I don't know if you remember the site that was around for a while, a UK site called Porno Kitsch.
I only know of it because it was in your bio. I was going to ask you about that later. But...
Okay. Anyway, so that was a site. It's still up. Totally badass site for sci-fi and fantasy. And as part of that, one of the guy who ran that blog with his wife, Jared Shuren, he blogs quite a bit at Tor.com. And he asked me to be part of a Dragonlance reread. And I don't know what I expected going back to those books. I still loved them, but they were not quite what I remembered also. So maybe that's where the tone of trepidation comes from.
Okay.
Also, to be honest, I have had subsequently conversations with people where when you're talking about, real, quote unquote, real fantasy, people make this face when you mention TSR Wizards of the Coast properties. There's a face.
Yeah, no, I know. But I mean, I haven't gone back and reread them since I was a kid, so maybe, I would be disappointed if I did. But I mean, like The Legend of Huma by Richard Knack, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
And, the second Weiss and Hickman trilogy, I forget if it was Legends or whatever. It's like
Legends,
Time of the Twins, etc. At least in my memory, that was an amazing story. So I don't know. Did you go back and reread that?
I didn't read the Legends. We just did the Chronicles trilogy.
Yeah, I mean those were adapted straight from the D&D module. So I wouldn't be surprised if those were a little formulaic or whatever.
It's actually, I still think it holds up story-wise. It was just more the way the stories were told and certain aspects of the stories, notably the relationships and especially the romantic relationships, just didn't really work for me the second time around. But I still think they hold up as stories, and I don't know, I don't have a problem with tropes. I don't even have a problem with things that are derivative, provided they're well done.
Yeah, I mean, like, Sturm Brightblade dying, that was the first, like, good guy dying that really hit me reading books. I mean, those are really formative books for me.
Yeah, me too. I did a drawing of Lorana standing over a dead Sturm that I was very proud of in grade 7.
Well, yeah, so let's talk about, so were you drawing around this time?
I was mostly drawing and playing music. I did quite a bit of writing around sort of grade 7, which may or may not coincidentally be around the time that my mom found some old typewriter that she had, and I was just fascinated with it as a machine. There was something about typing on it that was just so physically satisfying. The clacking of the keys and so I just sat in front of that thing, and I think I wrote a bunch of Star Trek books. And by books, I mean, kind of 10 chapters, which when you're 12 or 13 years old is pretty much a magnum opus.
Well, do you mean 10 pages?
No, 10 chapters.
And how long was each chapter?
Well, I don't know, Dave, because, the typewriter doesn't count the words. So I really don't know. But I bet you if I asked my mom, she has some of those pages in boxes somewhere. She's one of those people. Because
I had this experience where I had this quote unquote novel I was working on as a kid, and in my memory it was like 100 pages long, and then I went back and looked at it later, and it was actually like 12 pages long. So.
It could be, and I hand wrote some of this stuff too, and I was really interested in the Old West at around that time as well. So I seem to recall that I wrote, it was either a Young Guns fiction or a Young Riders fiction, but I was into really both of them, so I can't remember which it was. But there was just a lot of 20-something dudes running around with 6-shooters. That's all I really remember. But I'm sure it was awesome.
But then you set the writing aside for a while.
I did, yeah. I just was really intense about music for a long time, and I was pretty sure that's what I was going to do. But I was one of those people that, I don't know, couldn't really commit to one thing or another. I was, doing theater also. I was just kind of all over the place. And I didn't really get into writing seriously until I was much older.
So this is, so you went to, so you grew up in Calgary, right? And then went to college in Vancouver?
Yep.
And then, were you out of kind of fantasy and science fiction? Like, were you not like writing or going to conventions or anything through that period?
No, I attended my first convention in New York Comic Con a couple of years ago, like 5 years ago. So conventions weren't really on my radar, and I wasn't even really reading genre fiction for that period. Basically, through that university period, I wasn't reading that stuff at all.
Were you because you play a lot of video games now? Were you playing a lot of video games then?
I was playing a lot of video games. It's that I was still doing. Maybe like the one sort of junior high school pursuit that I never let go of other than music. But yeah, I wasn't really into that stuff then. I had stopped, kind of fell out of love with it or whatever. Or maybe I think it's partly too, some of the stuff that you maintain your interest in is dictated by your social circle. And the social circle that I left behind in Calgary, shared those interests. And the social circle that I had in Vancouver was much more interested in music. And so I think, and that was self-selecting in some ways, but, those things become sort of self-reinforcing. And so if nobody else around you is doing it, it's not necessarily something that you carve out a lot of time for, especially if you're a busy person, So yeah, I wasn't doing a lot of reading of any kind at that point, I have to say.
And so then did working for the UN come first, or getting back into writing come first?
Getting back into writing, but it was concurrent and related in the sense that, so we were in Vancouver and I had plans with a capital P, and then I met a boy. And he ended up getting a job with the UN in Geneva. So that kind of hit fast forward on our relationship because we had to get married we were planning to get married anyway by that point, but it kind of hit fast forward on all the plans, and we picked up and moved to Geneva. And I thought, this is going to be great because I have a graduate degree in international politics. I speak fluent French. This is perfect. I could not find a job. So my agent likes to say that I should write the book Jobless in Geneva, because that's really how it started. I needed a reason to have discipline and do something. And so I would kind of get up in the morning and sit at my computer. And I'm not really sure why I decided this was the time to do the writing that I had always kind of thought about back in my junior high school days. I couldn't really tell you why that's the thing I settled on, except perhaps that I didn't know anybody. And so it was one of the only things that I could do as a solitary pursuit that really felt satisfying. And so that's what I did. And I ended up around that time seeing an open call with, were they still TSR at that point, or were they Wizards of the Coast? I don't remember. This would have been around 2002, 2003.
I'm not sure. It's around the time that Wizards bought out TSR. I'm not sure what year it was exactly.
And they did an open call for a series they were doing called Realms of the Dragons. That was, short stories, an anthology. And they were doing 2 of those. And the first anthology was sort of all the big names working in the Forgotten Realms. I should have said it was Forgotten Realms. In their kind of stable of authors, as they put it. And then they did a second round. And in that second round, I ended up with a story in that. And so that's kind of how it all got launched. It was a little bit by accident, but I suppose that's the way life works.
Okay, so sorry. So you're in Geneva and you write this Forgotten Realms short story and just sort of send it in for this kind of contest.
Kind of, yeah. I'm skipping a step, which is that actually the contest, the open call, was for a novel, and I had just forgotten that until just now. But it was for a novel, and those of us who were shortlisted for the novel but didn't land the novel were asked to submit proposals for this anthology.
Did you write a novel?
No, this was just like you would do. I can't remember how many chapters it was.
Like 3 chapters or something.
Yeah, something like that.
And so then you're like, all right, I'm on my way. I got my short story published.
Well, at this point, I was like, this is a foot in the door with Wizards of the Coast that does a lot of, obviously, tie-in fiction. And so, they have a roster of authors that they call on, and this means that I get to be on the list of people who get to pitch novels. And indeed, that's what happened. And I ended up submitting a successful proposal for a novel for the Ravenloft line. And I was like, now that I have a book deal in hand, is where I get myself an agent. And I was absolutely adamant that this was the opportunity to get an agent, because of course, that's, if not the hardest step in your road to publishing, at least if you want to be traditionally published. If it's not the hardest step, it's definitely in the top 2. So I figured having a book deal in hand was a really good place to start in terms of getting an agent. And I was right about that. I don't know whether I would have made it over the transom otherwise. But through that process, I managed to get an agent. And then, then the train jumped the tracks pretty significantly, because they ended up canceling the Ravenloft line before that book ever got written. So that was a huge heartbreak. I remember being devastated. I was in the Congo at the time. I knew it was going to be bad news because I got an email from my agent saying, can we talk? And I was like, I'm in the Congo. And he said, yeah, but can we talk? I was like, oh God, this is not going to be good news. And it wasn't. And I remember being heartbroken, and he was just like, you don't need them. Just do your own thing. And so that's what I did. And he was very patient with me, writing what became Darkwalker, which was my debut novel. And he saw it through some drafts, did not spare the criticism. But
and this is not a tie-in novel. This is an original thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a secondary world dark fantasy mystery. And yeah, so I wrote that in a different part of Africa where I was basically on lockdown. I am no stranger to lockdown. I've spent a lot of my professional career in some shade of lockdown. So I have to say, when you're writing books, lockdown and books go well together.
Right. Well, that's because we sort of buried the lead there that you visited 50 different countries or something.
Yeah, I think I counted that at one point.
So on your LinkedIn page, you have your job titles listed as political risk analyst, research associate, emergency specialist, and peace building specialist. So I saw Street Fighter, so I feel like I basically know what that is, but maybe just expand on that for people who haven't seen Street Fighter.
I mean, those job titles are just the sorts of things that kind of only have meaning within that particular line of work. But I basically started out as a research assistant for a part of the UN that looks at small arms and light weapons mostly, but disarmament in general. So, the people who want to take all your guns. I'm being facetious. So I started out as a research assistant there, and then I ended up in a part of with UNICEF in a part of the UN that was dedicated to humanitarian response. And so my job was kind of being on the headquarters helpline, on the phone with the people in the field who needed some part of the headquarters apparatus to do something. So they needed supplies, they needed staff, they needed money, they needed diplomatic support, they needed something. And then I ended up being the person on the other end of the phone, who was getting sent out to support the response in the various countries, which is how I ended up in so many different places. And in so many different places where you couldn't really go out and do much, or if you could, there wasn't that much to do. So I spent a lot of time. Because
these are dangerous places.
Yeah, they're dangerous. And the UN is a very risk-averse organization. So it has a lot of very strict rules and regulations when it comes to where international staff, that is staff who are not from the country where they're working, where international staff are allowed to go. And so if you're in a place that's deemed a certain level of insecure for whatever reason, you kind of, there's a really restricted number of places that you're allowed to go and the conditions under which you're allowed to go there. And so you end up, spending a lot of time on either voluntary or actual lockdown.
Which is good for your writing career.
Well, it's nice. It was nice to have something to do because, that was kind of the pivot point between those days when all of the media that we had was in some sort of physical form, whether it's a CD or a DVD or whatever, and being able to download things. And so you'd be in these places where you had really no internet to speak of. There was no shopping of any kind. Your access to entertainment of any sort was extremely limited. And even just going out after dark to a house party was an undertaking. Everybody has to stop at 9:00 for radio check. And getting from A to B, you have to go in a convoy, or it has to be an armored vehicle, or blah, blah, blah. So
I don't even know, what does that mean, stop at 9:00 for a radio check?
In some places, you have to do a daily radio check. So when you arrive in an insecure place as an international
just to let them know
member,
that you're still there.
Alive and breathing.
Yeah.
Yep. And if you don't answer radio check in some places, they're pretty intense about it. So everybody gets a call sign, and you literally have to tune in at 9, and they call out the call sign of every single international staff member in that duty station. And it's just a slog. And you wait for your call sign, and then you come back and you say something 5 by 5, all clear, whatever, and you move on. It's a part of life and you can't forget.
So, okay, so picking up the story with the agent, so Darkwalker gets published, right? 2013.
Yep.
And so, kind of within what happened with your writing career from there?
So Darkwalker gets published. That was picked up as a 2-book deal. So Darkwalker and Master of Plagues. And then at the same time, for that same editor, I sold another series. So I actually had 5 books under contract before I'd even, sort of filed more than one book. So that was a time of desperate writing for me because I was under contract for 2 books a year while holding down a full-time job.
And had you ever met your agent and editor, or were you just abroad, so it was all over the phone or something?
I had met them by this point because I was still based in New York. So as much time as I spent in the field, I spent most of my time in New York. So I was fortunate in that way because I could have lunch with my agent and I could have lunch with my editor, and see them at various drinks events or whatever. So I had already met my agent. I had met my editor, I think, one time. And then, so they bought 2 different series and they decided that was both Ace Rock. So they decided to put one under Rock under one name and the other under Ace under a different name.
Different pseudonyms, just to...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. The Rock one being under E.L. Tettensor and the Ace one being under Erin Lindsey because they are just completely tonally different. And we kind of went from there. And so the Bloodbound trilogy, by the time that was finished, I was ready for something completely different. That by the time Bloodsworn came out, my stint with the UN was coming to an end. We were living in Burundi by that point. And I was exhausted, to be very frank. I was just shattered. We were living in Burundi, which is not an easy place to live. We were there at a particularly uneasy, unstable period. So I had these 2 books a year that I had coming out. I had a full-time job with the UN. And there was a coup and it was exhausting. So I needed to take 5. So that's what I did. And when I came up for air, I had a completely different idea for a completely different series in mind. And that's how the Rose Gallagher series came about.
Okay, so before we get to that, let me just, because I don't really know anything about the Bloodbound series, but it's sort of epic fantasy, right? Like secondary worlds.
Yeah,
swords and armor, horses, stuff.
It's a popcorn movie. It's secondary world. It doesn't have any other humanoid species or anything like that. It's all humans. It's roughly medieval. It's definitely informed by a lot of my experience in particular in Africa, but actually both of my fantasy series are, but in ways that you probably wouldn't notice unless you were quite familiar with those contexts. Just in terms of some of the cultural touch points. But it's basically the story of a noble woman who becomes bodyguard to the king at a time when her country is on the brink of being overtaken by an expansionist empire next door. And, there's a hefty dose of romance in it. It's Tanya Huff called it heroic fantasy more than epic fantasy. And I think I would agree with that just in terms of what the stakes are. It's the much more sort of personal stakes. There are kind of existential stakes to the degree that their kingdom might be conquered, but it's not going to end the world. So the stakes are very high for the people involved, but it's not something on the order of Lord of the Rings, for example.
Yeah, I mean, was it difficult writing a fantasy trilogy? You have to make up the whole world and everything.
I would say that it's most difficult at the beginning, and then the train kind of picks up momentum. Bloodsworn kind of that's the 3rd book in the series, kind of wrote itself. And I didn't have any experience writing a trilogy or anything of that narrative ambition before that. So I couldn't really say then whether it was typical, but now having 3 books under my belt of a different series, I feel kind of you do hit your stride you know intuitively how the characters are going to respond to a given situation, and you don't spend as much time, of course, thinking about the world building, because by that point, it's if it's not all on the page, it's probably all in your file somewhere, or at least in your head. So the heavy lifting is really done, I think, before you even start writing.
So I think I met you around the time, I think Bloodsworn had just come out, within the past year or something.
That sounds about right.
And so I met you at the Jabberwocky Literary Agency party,
Mm-hmm.
and I understood Lisa Rogers is your agent, right?
Yeah. Joshua started out as my agent, and then Lisa came in, and she's kind of the point person now.
Okay. Yeah. So had you, and I obviously I went to like hundreds of events in New York, and I don't think I'd met you up until that point, or, were you like going to like KGB or
No,
Nurses for any of that stuff?
I was almost never around. That was the period when I met you. I was either still living in Burundi or had just left. And that was the point where I was in New York maybe once a year.
Okay.
But even before that, the last 5 years or so of my UN career were very, very busy, very heavily overseas. So, I'd be in Pakistan for 3 months, or I'd be in Jordan for 3 months, or I'd be in Haiti or wherever for a long time. So I was at a couple of drinks events and things like that, but almost never was around coinciding with something that was going on, which was really frustrating for me, because of course meeting other people is hugely important, not just from a sort of career development point of view, but just it's nice to have other people to talk to and bounce ideas off of, not necessarily creative ideas, but well, that too, but sort of to understand your industry. And I kind of felt like I was in a bit of a bubble there. That, I was just such a neophyte about all of it and didn't really understand. Like, I remember so distinctly one of the only events that I went to was, I think it was, if it wasn't Jabberwocky hosting it, there were a lot of Jabberwocky people there. And Peter V. Brett was there. And Joshua introduced us. Joshua is also his agent. And he introduced us and he said, "This is Erin, and she's got 5 books under contract to whatever. But she's living in Burundi right now." And there was this look on Pete's face. And he said, "You're gonna do 2 books a year." And I said, "Yeah." And it was just, you could see the struggle of him wanting to say, "Are you crazy?" but being too polite to say, "Are you crazy?" And he was just like, "Good, that's nice." And I remember thinking right at that moment, have I made a terrible mistake? And I don't know if the answer was yes, but like I said, I just about blew out all the tires on it. I was so spent by the time it was over.
And I know, like, now you sort of split your time between, or I guess now you're in Calgary because of COVID, I guess, but like you were splitting your time between Calgary and New York. So like, was that the case then as well? Or like, is there a scene do you know any science fiction writers in Calgary? Or is there a scene there? I don't even know.
Well, there's a couple of sci-fi fantasy writers, including sci-fi fantasy writers of note in Calgary, and I've crossed paths with them. Some of them at there's a local festival called When Words Collide, and sort of cross paths on Twitter and things like that. But I admit that if there is a scene, I haven't really integrated myself into it yet. We have been here full time since 2016. But yeah, no, I can't, there's definitely an active local writer scene, but as far as sci-fi fantasy goes, it's not really something I've rolled up my sleeves and got into yet. I think in part because I've been so focused on the historical mystery side of things since I got here, that would be more the scene that I would probably be working with right now.
And so had you published, I guess there was the Forgotten Realms story. Had you written any, there's not any other short fiction that I could find except for something in the Sean Speakman's Unfettered 2 anthology. Had you been writing really any short fiction?
No, not at all. Not since high school. I literally didn't write a short story between high school and the one that ended up in Realms of the Dragons. which the one that so it was hard. I had forgotten. I mean, short fiction is a great medium because it's really challenges you to do more with less. And I quite like it, but no, I hadn't done much of it.
How did the Unfettered 2 thing come about?
That was a Penguin Random House signing event is how that came about in the margins of New York City Comic Con. And I met Sean there, and he was gracious enough to ask if I would be interested in participating. So I did a short story from the Bloodbound universe for that. And yeah, that was nice. I got to tell a little bit of backstory that I would not have otherwise been able to tell. So I appreciated that.
Yeah. And then earlier you mentioned Porno Kitsch. Like how'd you get involved with that?
In a really roundabout way. I'm trying to remember what the review. So Jared, if you've never read any of his reviews, they're amazing. I think he's one of the best reviewers out there. I don't know how much reviewing he's doing these days, but just really long and thoughtful reviews, often very funny, sometimes savage. I can't remember who he was reviewing. It was something grimdark. Anyway, there was something he said that I ended up wanting to talk about. You know me, I'm very contrary. So I had something to say about it. And I dropped a comment on his website and he responded to the comment and we got into a bit of a back and forth. And then somehow I don't remember if I suggested it or if he independently decided he wanted to read one of my books, but he did. And he liked it and he reviewed it very charitably. And became just kind of really a champion. And I really appreciated that about him. Anyway, so he asked me to start writing some blog posts for his site, which I did. I wrote a lot of blog posts for his site. For a while, I did a feature called Villain of the Month. And I religiously did it every month where I reviewed a villain from whether it was television or movies or whatever. And it was all over the place. I mean, it wasn't genre villains only. My favorite was the the feature I did on Al Swearingen from Deadwood, which I highly recommend. But yeah, so I think that's where I sort of cut my teeth on quote unquote criticism of, because I did write some reviews for his site as well. I recall I did a review for Logan. I don't know why that one sticks out. I think I did a Star Wars review as well. And yeah, so that's how that came about. And that was good fun.
Why is the site called Porno Kitsch?
It's a great question. I think Jared ended up devoting an entire post to that at one point, and I don't really remember the story, but it is really strange. And I think if they had it to do over again, they probably wouldn't have gone that route because their site it was the type of site where you would see comments from, big writers, Joe Abercrombie or Gail Carriger, he had people reading his reviews. But then you would try to link to it and you'd say, I've done a blog post at Porno Kitsch. And, a lot of people are just not going to click on that. And you'd be like, I don't know.
It seems like a foreseeable sort of issue that might come up.
Yeah, I really can't tell you how he ended up there, how he and Anne ended up there. I just don't know. I did read the story, but I've forgotten exactly what the backstory there is. But it is I agree. It's a non-choice.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool though. So you said you wrote like several dozen blog posts for them?
Yeah, well, because I had the Villain of the Month thing I did for about a year. So that's a dozen right there. And yeah, some other reviews and some stuff that I did. And through him, I did a few blog posts as well for Tor.com. That was kind of after he had set up that guest blogging about Dragonlance.
So you've written for those two sites, or have you done any other reviews or articles or anything?
Just those two. There's one that I'm particularly proud of on Tor.com that's like an extended Erin rant on gender reviewing in fantasy, if you're interested. It's called When Mary Sue Failed the Bechdel Test.
Sorry, on gender reviewing?
Yeah, like gendered reviews. People who think they're doing feminist reviews, but aren't.
No, I remember that that article. It went around because it was even like on was it Starship Sofa or something?
News to me. It did do the rounds a little bit. I don't know that you could say it went viral, but it did do the rounds a little bit.
I thought they had you on to talk about it.
Yeah, there was a podcast out of Vancouver that had me on to talk about it.
Okay.
Adventures in Sci-Fi Publishing.
Oh, okay. Was it them? All right.
That was my first podcast appearance.
Yeah. Have you done other podcasts besides Geeks Guide?
No, I'm exclusive to you, Dave.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well. Well, no, I mean, I don't know. It'll probably have been mentioned in the intro and stuff, but yeah, Erin's been on the show 24 times previously. You're actually the most frequent guest other than John Joseph Adams at this point. So.
Oh, really? Nice.
Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of people who are all kind of around 20 who, leapfrog each other you're repeatedly, but at the moment you're the number one.
Sweet.
All right. So you started talking about, so then you got into the Rose Gallagher series. So kind of how did that come about?
Yeah, that came about in a kind of, I like so many things, again, a strange sort of way. I was in Burundi, and around the time that my first book came out, I got a care package from my editor at Ace Rock, which was a really big deal because it was just, I can't emphasize enough how impossible it is to get just about anything in Burundi. So I get this big box full of books, and basically, she's kind of grabbed titles from all over the office of things that were coming out that Ace Rock was putting out. But, it came DHL, and it just was like a godsend. And in that box was Gods of Gotham by Lindsay Fay. I don't know if you've read it.
No.
Historical fiction set in New York in the 1860s, I believe, if memory serves. It's a story of a cop. Did you ever see that show, a short-lived show on BBC called Copper?
No, I don't think I've even heard of it.
Okay. Last Try, Caleb Carr's The Alienist.
I've
Still
heard
nothing.
of it, but I haven't read it.
Anyway, that kind of vibe anyway. Historical fiction, police procedural sort of set in 1860s New York. And I loved it. And it really, one of the things I loved, other than the fact that it's just beautifully written, I realized that at this point too, I was completely pining for New York City. I missed it so much because I was just a born New Yorker from the day I set foot in that city. And I loved it. And, when we moved away, it was really heartbreaking for me, and I missed it so much. So having this book, and I've always been super interested in history. Just every time I travel, I want to see all the oldest places and go there. And I just really feel like they're just steeped in so much feeling. It's like you can experience the memories in your head when you're in some of these places. And I love that about New York, that there's still so much of it that's so vivid. A lot of it hasn't changed physically for a long time. And what has changed has been so scrupulously recorded that I've just always felt that it's historically a very evocative city. And so it really kind of clicked for me that I would love to write something that was set a period piece in New York. But I was a fantasy writer, and I am a fantasy writer, and had a hard time envisioning myself doing anything that didn't have at least some speculative element. And so the Rose Gallagher mysteries came about as this idea to blend the desire to do historical fiction in New York with a supernatural element. And yeah, it just kind of came as a thunderclap, honestly. And the first line of the first book was in my head almost instantaneously, as soon as I decided on it as a concept. I remember quoting it to my husband in a cafe in Paris, just being like, here's the first line.
What was the first line?
As I tell you this story, I'll thank you to remember that I was young and in love.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's just one of those things that just kind of flew out of me. And that's how you know you're really inspired, is when you don't really have to stop to think too much about it. So a lot of the world building came ex post facto in the second draft. And the first draft was just kind of flying through the paces of a cozy mystery, essentially.
Yeah, well, so I just read The Silver Shooter, which is the third book in the series, and I haven't read the first two. And I actually, I had seen that that they were coming out and everything, and I didn't even realize they had supernatural elements. That wasn't necessarily apparent to me from the covers and stuff. So
Indeed.
at some point you just mentioned it, but I assume they're all the same, but the Silver Shooter, it's this very like clear mix of, like mystery, romance, historical, and supernatural.
Yeah.
Pretty even proportions are all, like.
Yeah. And the balance between them shifts somewhat from one book to the next. But the fact that you didn't realize that is, I would say, deliberate to the extent that, Minotaur is a mystery publisher. They're not a spec fic publisher, and they are marketing this and have always marketed this as historical mystery with a dash of supernatural. And so they've definitely, in terms of the titles that have been chosen for the book, the cover treatments, all of that, is very deliberately cueing for cozy historical mystery. It's not an accident that speculative element isn't front and center.
So then do people ever read them and they're just like, what's this ghost doing in my historical
all
novel?
The time. I take it you haven't been on the Goodreads page.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, there's lots of it. And so the surprise element was definitely, surprise, there's a ghost, was definitely foreseen and deliberate. And the gamble is that more people will be pleasantly surprised than unpleasantly surprised. It's always been, I confess, and I hope it's not too transparent to say, a bit of a nail biter for me as a strategy. When I order vanilla ice cream, I don't want chocolate ice cream. Even if I love chocolate ice cream, I ordered vanilla. So I'm a little bit, wary of the surprise kind of marketing technique. But does
the jacket, the jacket copy, I think for this one makes it pretty clear. Actually, I'm not sure. Let's see.
Yeah. Yes, you would be surprised how many people don't read the jacket copy.
An agent of the special paranormal branch of the Pinkerton Agency. So that seems pretty forthright.
It does, and it's more forthright now that we're in book 3. But the back cover copy, and I don't want to create the impression that they're trying to hide it. They're not. It's a carefully calculated balance, though, where they want you to overwhelmingly think historical mystery. And then they don't want to hide the supernatural, but they want you to very much be aware that that's kind of not front and center. And I think that's right in terms of the balance of the book. It is, as you say, fairly evenly balanced between those things. And that balance does shift. Like I would say there's, and it's interesting too, just as a side note, to see in the reviews in the trade publications and things, sometimes people really see what they want to see in the sense that one reader will say this one has way more supernatural than the previous book, where another reviewer will say the exact opposite, or the romance is really heated up in this one, or the romance really takes a back seat in this one. So it's kind of funny, like where that balance lies seems to vary to some degree from one reader to the next. But from my perspective, there's the most speculative element in book 1, the least in book 2, and book 3 is somewhere in between.
But it looks like the response is pretty positive. I didn't read the reviews really, but they're, on Amazon, it looks like all the, it was like 4.5, 5-star reviews for the most part.
Yeah, I think I've been fortunate, and the trade publications have been very kind. And there's been a couple of stars for this series, and it was featured in BuzzFeed a couple of times, and the reception has been good. How that will translate into sales remains to be seen. It's definitely the case that the series is still finding its feet in that regard. But I can't complain about the quote unquote critical reception. And the audience reception, as far as Goodreads as a barometer, has been quite good too.
Yeah, well, part of the reason I wanted to have you on is just, after you've been on the show so many times, I hope that people, notice appreciate your contributions to Geek's Guide and, might be interested in checking out your work. And I'd never had a chance to read any of it, so I was kind of curious to check it out. And so, yeah, I really encourage people. It's a super fun book, The Silver Shooter, if you are interested in those things, romance, mystery, paranormal, historical. It's really, really good and strong in all those areas. I'll tell you that actually what really got me to read this one is that, I just recently moved to Texas, so I was kind of in the mood to read something about cowboys.
Cowboys, yeah.
And I'm also a big Teddy Roosevelt. Well, I don't know, wouldn't say I know a lot about Teddy Roosevelt, but I have this funny Teddy Roosevelt story that's always made me kind of interested in Teddy Roosevelt. So those were kind of the things. You want to hear my
Yeah,
funny
absolutely.
Teddy Roosevelt story? So my parents and I was probably, I don't know, 14 or 15 or something, and we went to this place called Mohonk House. It's this kind of ski resort in upstate New York. And this was like pre-internet, so like, there wasn't a lot to do if you're a kid, but they had kind of kid events. And one of the kid events was they were showing Hook, the Steven Spielberg movie where it's like Robin Williams as Peter Pan grown up. And I didn't know it was bad like back then because there was no internet. And so I went to go watch Hook, and I walk into this ballroom, and there's all these chairs set up, and I sit down, and I'm like, I don't see any screen. I wonder where they're going to show Hook, And I kind of look around, and everyone in the audience has white hair, right? I'm like the only person under 60 in the whole room. And I'm like, At
this point, your spidey sense is tingling.
This seems like a weird audience for Hook, but I don't know. It's my first time at Mohonk House. I don't even know. And so then this guy comes in. He's like, "Hi, everyone. I'm Teddy Roosevelt." And he goes around and shakes everyone's hand. And I'm like, why do they have Teddy Roosevelt like introducing Hook? This is like such a weird event, And then like, obviously, eventually I realized I've gone to the wrong room. But it's this Teddy Roosevelt impersonator. And he was amazing. He tells he's like, when I was a kid, I was like scrawny and weak, but through sheer force of will, I just like worked out and became super strong. And so I was like, this Teddy Roosevelt guy is really interesting. I'm trying to remember. There's one other thing that really stuck in my mind. Let's see. I had a note. Let's see. Oh, the story about teddy bears.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I feel like this is becoming too much about me, but the very short version is that Teddy Roosevelt had a reputation as a hunter, and so this mayor, as a publicity stunt, wanted Teddy Roosevelt to come to town to kill the bear that was kind of wandering around in town. And Teddy went to go shoot it, and it was so cute, he just couldn't bring himself to shoot it. And so it became kind of like a funny story, and they started making these little bears, that were the bear that it was so cute that he couldn't shoot. And that's where teddy bears come from. So
yeah. Yeah, the version of the story I heard was a little bit different, that he came for a hunt and he was supposed to shoot a grizzly bear, but they didn't find one. And so, as a publicity stunt, I don't remember it was a mayor who it was, but it, like basically had a bear tied up and was like, "Here you go." And Roosevelt was like, "Are you kidding me? I'm not going to shoot a captive bear. What's wrong with you, man?" I'm just telling you like how I remember it when I was 14 when I was trying to find Hook. So like, don't take anything I say too all
seriously.
Right, okay. But he's an amazing figure. Not perfect, of course, but of all the historical figures that I've researched over the years, for whatever reason, he's by far the most compelling and most interesting. He just the sheer force of personality. And the determination. I don't know that I could name another person who seems to have just been so fixated on becoming a certain thing, come hell or high water, no matter how implausible it was. And it just, he's a fascinating person. And I've read a lot by him and about him at this point, and I still just can't get enough. He's
almost like a fantasy character.
Even in his flaws, he's interesting. Go ahead.
No, that's all I was just gonna say. He's like
no, but he is.
Character.
I mean, and it's funny to me. Even my mom just finished The Silver Shooter, and she came to the author's note, and she was like, "I just thought you made all that stuff up." And I was like, "Okay, first of all, I never make stuff up. It's kind of my thing. Like, I will put myself through torturous plot devices in order to not make things up." Like if there's documentary evidence that someone was in the bathroom at this time, they're going to be in the bathroom in the book because it's on paper. I never make anything up. So that kind of annoyed me. But anyway, beside that, it just, even people of her generation, just all of this stuff, it sounds like legend, and you would be perfectly, it's perfectly reasonable to think that all of these different lives could not have been led by the same person, but they were.
Well, and a lot of characters in this book are historical figures or inspired by historical figures.
Yeah. And that's kind of the fun part about it. for me is blending that fact with fiction. And so for each of the books, all three, Murder on Millionaire's Row, Golden Grave, and this one, Silver Shooter, they all started in terms of plotting with an actual historical event that just either sounded fishy or cool or like a good plot device. So for the first book, it's the blowing up of Flood Rock in 1885. There used to be, just off Astoria in Long Island Sound there used to be, there's like all those little atolls kind of. Well, that's not the right word for it. They're rocks, small islands in the East River there, between Queens and Manhattan. And in 1885, the Army Corps of Engineers decided to blow one up to make it easier for ships to get by. So they did it. It was at the time the largest explosion ever. And it shattered windows like all the way across to the Hudson River. It was huge. And the newspapers made a great deal out of it. And it was just like a really big deal. So they have this huge explosion in the East River in a place called Hellgate. And I was like, well, obviously, that's a good place to start. So in the book, that explosion accidentally pops open a portal to the other world. And all these dead people start coming out. So that's kind of the jumping off point for book one. And then book two was Theodore Roosevelt running for mayor of New York. So it's kind of part political thriller, part comedy of manners, because it's in book one, Rose is a housemaid and her boss goes missing. And this is how she ends up getting into the detection business, is that she takes it upon herself to find her missing boss. So by book two, she's a Pinkerton, and she's learning to navigate high society. So there's a lot of comedy of manners of, Irish housemaid Rose Gallagher is, in the orbit of Astors and Vanderbilts, and she doesn't have any idea how to conduct herself. And then book three is Roosevelt asking them to investigate what he believes to be supernatural happenings at his ranch in the Dakota Badlands. And all of that, and that was predicated on an actual incredibly devastating winter that happened in 1886.
Right. And there's all these, real historical cowboys and stuff, like the sheriff from Deadwood and outlaws and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And each of the books has historical figures in it. My favorite to incorporate in book two was Nikola Tesla, because obviously, but, every James Bond needs a Q. And if it so happens that at that particular period, Tesla was between jobs because he had just had his big falling out with Edison. He had yet to hook up with Westinghouse. So it was a good period to have, Nikola Tesla rattling around with nothing better to do than to make supernatural gadgets for our intrepid heroes. So that was a lot of fun too.
Yeah. And so one thing, there's a lot of sort of like historical terms that I wasn't, they're kind of like, oh, that's a real term. I'm sure like yellowback novels. And there's also references to dime novels. I was just curious, is there a difference between dime novels and yellowback novels? And did you read any as research?
I did not read any, although I perused their covers at great length. It's a rabbit hole I highly recommend. But I don't know that there's a difference between the two. Dime novels, simply, of course, referring to cheap novels. Yellowback, it seems to me, and I've forgotten, it'll be in my notes somewhere. You should see my notes. Stacks and stacks and stacks. But it's something to do with the company that first became successful putting out these pulp novels. They had yellowbacks.
Yeah.
And it sort of became synonymous with it. But yeah, one of the things that I love most about writing this series, aside from the fact that it's fluff and fun, and it makes no pretensions to the contrary. It's just feel good books, lots of humor, sort of rollicking adventure. There's nothing head scratching or thematically heavy about it at all. But that isn't to say that it isn't an intellectual pursuit for me, at least as the writer, because I spend so much time. One of the reasons it takes me so long to write these books is because I fall down a rabbit hole on almost a daily basis in the research, because I just find it all so interesting. And so you wouldn't necessarily know it in the page, but I will say it's all tweezed to within an inch of its life. There isn't a word used that I haven't looked up to make sure it's period accurate. At least I don't think so. I've been very careful about it. There's a whole bunch of, all of that jargon and terminology and turns of phrase. I have a book on period slang, like all of it, because I like the craftsmanship of it. It's fun for me, even if nobody knows that it's there.
How about the supernatural stuff? I don't know if this is maybe too much of a spoiler, but one of the terms in the book is the Alraun, Alraun. Is that something you invented, or is that drawn from something?
No, it's out there. It's a German. Spell the right word? I'm not even sure, but it's got Germanic roots. Hence that word with Germanic roots, and it's you can find it on a number still today of witchcraft sites. And it's as described in the book. It doesn't generally result in a monster, but it's a way of capturing a spirit within a root, usually of a mandrake or an ash. And all that stuff about ash trees, all of that, that comes up in all of the books. That's all got basis in a number of different traditions. All the stuff that I talk about at the beginning of the book, when they're sitting at the back of Mr. Wang's shop and they're talking about elementals, all of the traditions that they talk about there, that's all real stuff. I didn't make any of it up.
I was going to ask you about the ash and also the salt water and mineral water. That's a real tradition?
Yeah, I mean that's something that you see a lot in association with the Fae, and a lot of the different European traditions have overlap in that, where certain elements, it's usually salt or iron, again ash, are things that repel the Fae or that keep the dead at bay. There are different takes on it, but it's one of the things that I find interesting when you're researching spiritualism and all of that sort of various mythical traditions is the degree of overlap from vastly different cultures. There's a lot of overlap between them, which is really interesting. Like the ash tree comes up in a lot of different cultures. For example, the idea of elementals comes up in many, many major traditions, Eastern and Western. So it's really interesting to see how humanity has kind of taken the same inputs and come up with a lot of the same outputs in terms of the narratives that we craft to explain some of these things that we don't understand.
Yeah, and then they all end up in the monster manual. So
exactly,
nice.
They do. They do. Fun fact: I have a creature in the D&D monster manual, the Forgotten Realms one. Anyway, I don't know to what degree they change between the various D&D, the various properties, the worlds. But there's a Forgotten Realms dragon that is based on one of my characters, so that's fun.
What book, like what monster manual would you know for sure that it's in? The one that you came up with? Forgotten
Realms. I've got it in, I don't know, ages ago now, 2002, 2003.
Yeah, so probably 3rd edition.
Maybe. It's in my bookshelf. I'd have to look.
So what's this? How did it end? How did your monster end up in the monster manual?
It's from that short story that I mentioned from Realms of the Dragons. It's the protagonist in that story is actually a dragon. It's a fairy dragon. And then his sidekick is a mist dragon. And the mist dragon, Sirothamelan, ended up, and they, by the way, never even informed me of that. I completely found out by accident. But anyway, they took that character and put it in the monster manual.
How did you find out?
Google, I think. I don't remember.
You just Googled like mist dragon? Or?
Just as I say that, I'm like, what would the occasion be that would have me Googling that? Maybe I was looking for reviews of the book and I typed in character names. That sounds like something I would have done back when I was a novice and didn't realize what a terrible idea that is.
Yeah,
I like to think every writer goes through that period where they think it's a good idea to read their reviews.
I'm just imagining you're like playing Dungeons and Dragons and the dungeon master's like, and then the tomb opened up and out emerged the mist dragon such and such. You're like, wait a minute.
Wait, what?
That's how I found out. They'd used my monster.
No royalties for my monster, alas.
Well, it was work for hire, wasn't it? Right? Like,
It was.
That's why
yes.
they could just take your monster and stick it and stuff.
But an email would have been nice.
Do you ever play Dungeons and Dragons?
No, I never have.
You never have? Not
no.
once?
Well, I don't. I tried one time. This guy in university hosted a game, and we went to the game. But I can't say a lot of the game was played at the game. Let's leave it at that.
Okay. I mean, it is a pretty common thing where, you get together to play Dungeons and Dragons and don't ever actually get around to playing Dungeons and Dragons.
We just smoked a lot of weed and didn't play any Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
We had a lot of existential conversations. I'm sure we solved some really important world questions, but no Dungeons and Dragons was played at that time.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was more like, like early high school. So it was more you just like get together and then like read the rules and then never actually get, and like spend like 4 hours creating your characters and then it's time for everyone to go home. So
that sounds about right. We got through the rolling stage and I think it would be disappointing that we didn't play because the dungeon master was like all squeaky about like high pitched. What is this even? Thinking I was cheating with my dice rolls. Apparently they were all amazing. Everything was like in the 20. Rolled just constant 20s. It's like, what is this? So I probably should have played that character at some point. But I was much more, you know what I did do though? I bought a lot of the lead figurines and painted them.
Oh, yeah.
That I did do. I really enjoyed that.
Do you still have those?
I don't. And it's really too bad because I had one in particular, a dragon. And it was just gorgeous. He had stripes, black and red. And it was just, it was a beautiful thing of beauty. Like the model itself was beautiful. And then I was really proud of how I painted it. But I don't know whatever happened to that, but it's a shame I didn't keep it.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you move overseas again and again and again and again. You shed your belongings quite quickly. When it costs
that would be pretty cool if you had
to move them.
A Dungeons and Dragons miniature that had been to 50 countries. You could be like that gnome from Amelie. Is that the movie where there's like the pictures of him all over the world?
That's basically my cat now.
All right, cool. So what's happening with? Are there going to be any more Rose Gallagher books?
I hope so. I don't know yet. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, to be honest, with COVID. And I think everybody's moving in super slow-mo. Like this book, I still don't even have a copy of the book, by the way, which is so frustrating. Just everything is literally so far behind and gummed up in the pipeline that I don't know. But I would love to think so. In the meantime, I'm working on something different. A fantasy novel for the first time in a long time that I'm super excited about, but can say no more.
Can you say what genre, like what subgenre of fantasy it is?
I think probably you would call it epic fantasy. The thing about me is I seem to have this inability, and it's not deliberate, but I seem to have this inability to write anything that's straightforward. So I think, one of my publishers have always had the challenge of how do we market this thing that is neither fish nor fowl? A bit like, with the Rose Gallagher series, is it historical mystery or is it fantasy? Or, the answer is yes. So this is a long way of saying I'm not really sure that when I say epic fantasy, it's that it's like mostly falling in epic fantasy. There will be a heavy romance element because that's my jams. But this one has a lot more thematic resonance for me. And I think it will probably draw more on my professional experience than my previous outings, just to the extent that this one very deliberately has some themes in it that are things I've been thinking about for a long time. Whereas the others have been much more plot character driven. I haven't really spent a lot of time on, nothing is an allegory or a metaphor in any way meant to have historical resonance. It is what it is. This one is definitely drawing more on some experiences that I've had and that have really changed me as a person.
Because you haven't written any or said any fiction outside North America, right? Like in the real world outside North America.
No. And this fantasy is a secondary world as well. No, I haven't. And I've thought about to what degree am I ready to, because for a long time I just simply wasn't ready, but ready to sort of tap into a little bit more directly some of my own experience. And I still think about that. But I haven't written anything other than the Rose Gallagher series that takes place in some place that actually exists.
Yeah. It just seems like you're perfectly situated to write like a Tomb Raider, James Bond world traveling kind of thing.
Yeah.
Indiana Jones.
And for a variety of reasons, I haven't felt comfortable doing that. A big part of it was, it's just not something I could have considered while I was still working for the UN, just even legally. But, and then afterwards, I kind of felt like I needed some distance. Like maybe, I don't know, maybe I just take things too seriously, but it's a bit hard to play fast and loose with something that's important to you, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Something that has for so long been played with fast and loose by just about everybody else. I think I said on another show, there are sort of a handful of professions or walks in life that you see often on the big screen or on the small screen. If you're a police officer or maybe an emergency physician or a trial lawyer or something like that, you're kind of used to seeing your job on the screen, and it's wrong. But I suspect nothing has been more abused than the United Nations. I really don't think I've ever seen a remotely accurate depiction of it on the screen. So that is possibly all the more reason why somebody like me should do it. But then for whatever reason, I haven't got there mentally, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I was also just curious. We mentioned that this third book is sort of a Western. Are you a fan of Westerns or weird Westerns or anything?
I went through a phase of being really excited about all things Western. I come from a place where it's kind of part of our brand. The Calgary Stampede is a big deal every year. Not this year for the first time in a century because of COVID, but it's kind of part of my DNA, as it were. But in terms of reading Westerns, I've only read a couple, but certainly I am a big fan of good Western movies. There's some Western movies that are like Hollywood pulp that I really enjoyed. Silverado comes to mind. Have you ever seen that?
No.
It's a good one. It's a fun one. But I definitely have all the time in the world for movies like The Unforgiven. That's just a great movie.
Yeah. It was funny because we did an episode on weird Westerns. So I just went back and listened to them. I was just curious what we had talked about. And we basically had concluded that The Burrowers was the only good weird Western movie. So
I haven't seen it.
If you haven't, it's really, it's not very well known, but it's quite good. It's a sort of low budget horror Western movie, but, featuring obviously like subterranean monsters.
What was the one that came out not too long ago? Is it Aliens versus Cowboys? Is that right?
Cowboys versus Aliens, yeah.
Okay, all right, yeah. You know what? I remember watching it, and that's about it. I don't remember if I liked it or not. That sounds
right. Yeah. No, it's very forgettable. I recall it being a decent Western until the aliens show up, and then it just becomes a terrible, terrible movie.
Yeah. That sounds about right.
Any contribution to the positive contribution to the weird Western genre is always appreciated. We're pretty much out of time, so we should start wrapping this up pretty soon. Do you have any final thoughts or any other projects you want to let people know about?
No, I just think if you're looking for something that's a pick me up and a little shameless escapism, you could definitely do worse than the Rose Gallagher series right now. But I just really appreciate you having me on the show. I know that it's not squarely in your wheelhouse, this type of fiction, so I do appreciate it.
Yeah, it was funny. My girlfriend Steph saw the cover and she's like, "Oh, that doesn't look like a book that you would read." And then
you're like, "Not really, no."
Book. But no, it's super fun. Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of shootouts and like monsters and magic and stuff. So, for if you're into that sort of thing, and like I said, Erin's been very generous with her time helping out on this podcast. So, it would be good if people would check out this book, because as she said, this is kind of a tough time for books.
Yeah,
to be coming
it
out,
is.
so.
It's a tough time for everybody, and I'm sure you saw Simon & Schuster is now. It looks like they're going to be bought, if they can be, by Penguin Random House. Did you see that?
I saw that.
Yeah.
Well,
So it's just it's just more like it's so much pressure on anything mid-list. It's basically go big or go home. It's going to be all big box properties pretty soon across the board. So it's sad.
Well, not if I have anything to say about it. So
fight the good fight, Dave.
Yeah, so everyone go check out this book. It's called The Silver Shooter by our guest today, Erin Lindsey. So Erin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Erin Lindsey for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.